Hello and welcome to Chatterbox, the Culips series for intermediate to advanced English learners that is designed to help you improve your fluency and reach the next level with your English. My name's Andrew. I will be your host for today, and joining me for this episode is a very special guest, Jesús Florez. Jesús is making his second appearance on Culips. He was on the show back in 2024, but he's back for round two. And in our conversation that you'll hear in just a moment, we talked all about how he built his fluency from the intermediate level to a very, very, very high level of English. I think Jesús is amazing. Really, I really enjoyed our conversation that we had. He is very natural with his English in many different aspects of it, in his pronunciation, in his grammar, in his vocabulary use, in his idiom use, his phrasal verb use. Across all of the aspects of English, Jesús has reached a super, super high level. And I was thinking in my head as I was talking with him that it's almost like he's like the Michael Jordan or the Wayne Gretzky of English learning. Like he's one of these guys who has really just accomplished so much and has hit the top levels of English fluency as a second language English learner. And so I think it's a great idea to have these kinds of people on Culips from time to time, because not only do I find them really inspiring, and speaking with Jesús, I got all pumped up to study Korean, which is my second language, and he really inspired me. So thank you, Jesús, for that inspiration. But I think for you guys as well, it's great to hear from people who have achieved these really high levels of fluency. Jesús is also a Culips member, so he hangs out on our Discord community from time to time. He pops into some of our Culips speaking classes from time to time, and so he's just an awesome community member as well. And I really enjoyed getting to talk with him. So we'll get to that conversation in just a second. Before we do, I want to let you know that there is a 100% free study guide for this episode. For every Culips episode where we have a special guest, we always give the study guide away for free. So yeah, it's a great resource, usually only for members, but because it's a special guest episode, we're giving that away free for everyone. So just click the link in the description to get that. Check it out, and I hope you'll find it helpful for following along with this episode. Of course, Jesús is an English learner. He's someone who's learned English as a second language, but his vocabulary is extensive. And I do have to say he does use some kind of difficult words from time to time in this episode. So probably for some of you, the transcript will be really helpful, and you'll find that in the study guide. All right. Well, I think let's get right to it. Without any further ado, let's welcome Jesús onto the show. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Here we go. And joining me now to talk about his English language learning journey, specifically going from intermediate to the advanced level, is my special guest for today, Jesús Florez. Jesús, welcome back to Culips.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm very happy to be back. It has been a long time in the making.
Yeah, a long time in the making for sure. The last time you were on the program was in 2024, maybe a couple of years ago.
That is correct. Yes, it was episode 319 of the Chatterbox series.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Episode 319. Great. So great to have you back. And Jesús, I wanted to have you back on the show because you're such a great example of a successful English learner. And I think it's important for our audience to have these role models that they can look up to, people who have gone through the process of learning English and have done it successfully. And you're really a great example of that. I mean, your English is amazing, super fluent. Your accent is really, really native-like. I'm sure. I know you live in the States, Jesús, but I'm sure if you didn't tell people that you weren't a native speaker, most people wouldn't assume that you're an English learner. They'd mistake you for a native speaker. So you've hit like the highest of the high levels with your English. And so you're a great guy, an expert to talk about this topic. And so, yeah, I'm excited to dig in and get into it today. And we decided to focus on the media that you used to help you break through that intermediate plateau. Often we call it the intermediate plateau, right? Like when you first start learning English at the beginning stages, sometimes you can make really rapid growth with your learning, and it feels like you're constantly learning new things and applying new things. But then you hit that intermediate level, and that rapid growth just doesn't come as quickly as it used to. And we feel like we stagnate and we don't really improve. But you were able to break through this intermediate plateau. And yeah, we're going to talk about some of the ways that you did that. And yeah, I'll maybe let you take it from here, Jesus. What are some of those ways that you were able to break through that intermediate plateau?
Basically, what happened in my case was that I created my own immersion experience. And in order to talk about that properly, I need to set some context. As some of the listeners may remember, back in 2024, when we recorded my first appearance on the podcast, I mentioned a very important, pivotal, I would say, year in my English language learning journey. And that was 2008. I will bring that up again here because it really sets the stage for the way that this happened for me. So, just to recap, in 2008, I was doing a lot of things related to English. The first and most important thing was that I was preparing to take an English proficiency exam. By the time I took it in November of 2008, I had already been preparing a year and a half, intense preparation for a proficiency test. And so I was strongly motivated to improve my English. Part of what led me to the advanced levels beyond the intermediate ones was the desire to pass this test, to score, well, to get top marks on the test. And in 2008, in order to do this, I had this idea, although initially it started a little bit differently, but I had this idea of watching anime. Initially, like most people, the first contact I had was with the original Japanese language dub with English subtitles. I don't know exactly how I made the decision or how I actually got started thinking about, okay, uh, could I use or could I leverage, these shows to help me in preparation for the test? And so very early on, I made the decision to go from subs to dubs, English language dubs.
Hmm.
And at least at the time, they were relatively easy to find on the internet. And the very first show that I watched was Naruto. I know that I mentioned this back, a couple of years ago. But Naruto was the gateway to uh, the hundreds of shows that I ended up consuming over the next 3 or 4 years. Uh, 2008 was, the time when that started. Naruto was the beginning. And one of the first things that caught my attention about the English language dub was that it served as remarkable, or I mean, superb preparation material for the listening paper of the test that I ended up taking. The audio, the dubs, were narrated at a speed that mirrored very closely the practice material that I had access to, back in the day. And it was almost like listening to extended listening, uh, let's say passages or tracks. And so you can imagine that really solidified um, listening, in my mind. And it really made, when I look back, made the listening portion of the test a breeze, all things considered. Because I mean, this was
Wow.
a very demanding test that I ended up taking. It's interesting because you see, when I started preparing for the test, the listening portion of it seemed particularly daunting. Because again, this is what started my transition from intermediate to advanced levels. And A lot of the times, what happens there is that you're used to a number of words or very simple vocabulary topics or themes, in general. But then you are kind of like, um, you know, let's say you're put to the test, just to keep the thing going on here. And your abilities are stretched, especially when you have to listen to longer, extended monologues, especially monologues. And there's a lot of that actually going on in anime shows. Characters go into soliloquies, as we say, and so that was perfect practice, for those extended passages that I ended up facing, during the real test.
Are you ready to take your English to the next level? Then sign up and become a Culips member. Becoming a Culips member is an amazing way to take full advantage of all of the great tools that we give our members to improve their English. As a Culips member, you will get access to over 1,200 lessons that are designed to improve your fluency. And for every lesson, you'll get an interactive transcript and a helpful study guide, plus quizzes and more. But that's not all. Perhaps the best part is you'll be able to join us for our weekly speaking classes. We have several classes each and every week, and as a member, you're able to come to as many of the classes as you would like. So the idea is first you listen to the podcast, you think about it, you study with the study guide, and then finally you practice your English output as well during our speaking classes. So for all of the details and to sign up and become a member for an affordable price, just visit our website, culips.com. And a huge thanks to all of our members out there. Guys, we really appreciate you, and we couldn't do Culips without you. So thank you so much. Maybe first you could tell us a little bit about this anime, Naruto, because I'm actually not too familiar with it. I know it's a famous title. I've heard the name before, but like what genre is it? Maybe many people who are not super familiar with Japanese animation style, they don't really know that there's such a variety of different animes, and there's everything from slice of life to like mechanical robot fighting animes to sports animes and the whole spectrum. So what kinds of vocabulary, what kind of language were you hearing in this program?
So Naruto, I believe, technically speaking, is classified as a shonen series, meaning that it is designed primarily with, I want to say, an adolescent or teenage audience. And typically, you are dealing with a hero arc or story, sort of a coming of age, mixed in as well. Naruto is about ninjas and, um, you know, special, abilities and powers. You can even perhaps use the word magic here, but mostly it is about Naruto maturing from, a petulant, childish, like 11 or 12 year old maturing, into, let's say, a role model and facing all kinds of challenges and difficulties along the way. There is, I would say, a lot of language related to introspection, reminiscing, reflecting on the past, and thinking about the future. And so you probably would encounter, a lot of um, uses of the conditional tenses to speculate about the future. A lot of simple and present perfect, even past perfect, to connect different past experiences and see, perhaps what you have learned, from having gone through a certain process or dealt with a certain situation. Actually, when I say that, the shows were incredible. Naruto and the other three shows that I'm going to mention, they were incredibly rich in terms of grammar. Because that is a fundamental building block of language, and it is how, you make sense, of, let's say, the experiences that you wish to share. And so the mixing of all of these tenses is great. to finally, get a good handle and a native like, handle on how we use tenses, in everyday life to narrate, our lives and, and to, I guess, continue to learn from that. So there is actually a great deal of grammar, that was, clarified and solidified as a result of all of that.
How about the dubbing quality itself? Like, the voices were done by native speakers, I assume. And I've heard that some older animes maybe don't have that great quality of dubbing. But what was your experience like with the dub? I'm sure switching from the original Japanese with the subtitles to the English dub may have been quite shocking at first, but probably once you got used to it, it was okay.
Absolutely. Yes. And you see, the interesting thing is that I only really watched the subs for a very short time before I pivoted to the dubs. I want to say, to the best of my recollection, that I started watching Naruto in Japanese in March of 2008. And I must have probably shifted gears to the English dub a couple of months after the fact, May of 2008, give or take. It was not hard at all to get used to the English language voices. Um, if anything, I was biased because I really wanted to maximize, my preparation and the time that I had, before the test, came up. And so that was a very strong motivator to, you know, jump in with both feet, as we say, into the dubs. And so getting used to the voices was not a problem. I was never really into the debate over whether sub or dub is better. But the quality of the voice acting was superb. My opinion was, or I mean, is that the work put in and the performances delivered by these people were just astounding. And I actually have some names, that I want to mention specifically because, their performances were not only, well, stellar, but also the way that they talked and the way that they acted is something that inspired me to change my own speaking style to resemble, the way that they talked, even though it was, a show, even though it was acting. These actors, had perfect diction, I think is the best way to put it. And I really wanted to imitate, the resonance, the cadence, the rhythm, all of those things. In Naruto, some people might have heard about Crispin Freeman. Crispin played a character in Naruto that always spoke with a very low and kind of rumbling voice quality. And it was just, so exhilarating to hear. And his words were always carefully chosen. It's like he weighed the impact of every word that he chose. And to this day, I remember two lines that were just delivered with such, um, let's say, artistry, that I have, retained them to this day. It was something like this: we're pulling out, as in we're leaving. I think it was Kisame, the name of the character that he was talking to. No, Kisame, we're pulling out. Your moves tend to stand out. That line has stuck with me for all those years because Crispin's deliverance, of it was just perfect. I mean, it really just was.
So, what do you think it was about that line that stuck with you so deeply? Was it like the emotional impact of the deliverance? Was it the specific scene that that line took part in or place in? Like, what was it about that line that just buried itself in your memory?
One reason why that has stuck in my mind is because of the phrasal verbs used by the actor in those two lines, stand out and pull out. From a linguistic standpoint, makes itself, I guess, noticeable because you learn early on that phrasal verbs can have a range of meanings, more literal and more figurative. In that case, those two lines that I remember, the use of pull out and stand out were figurative. Pulling out in that case for them meant retreating from the position where they were in. And then stand out meant that what his partner was saying or doing was attracting too much attention to their presence. And they were trying to be surreptitious, secretive, kind of like, ninjas in a way. And so that is actually a perfect example of what I call learning vocabulary in a meaningful context, one that makes you remember, the proper use and meaning of a lexical item or a set. That's why it's been so memorable. In addition to the acting part of things, and just really getting into character. But yeah, those two things, the linguistic value and the artistic value, kind of like second place, but definitely the language is what really made that has stuck, with me, has made me remember that all these years. I actually have another example, and I'm gonna actually mention here a different show, just because I have to just give it the proper context here as well. So Naruto was the very first show. I'm gonna actually skip two shows here to mention one that taught me an expression that I still remember, to this day. Another show that I watched that was again had all of these same qualities of superb acting, uh, gold mine of information for language acquisition, was a show called Romeo and Juliet. It was, as you can expect, um, primarily based on the play by Shakespeare, with some twists. But the basic plot was the same. And there is this phrase that I remember, which is having or holding the floor. When you are in a meeting, for
Okay.
instance, if you are the person talking, especially when you are talking about, let's say, a high level or a high stakes meeting, the person talking, addressing the other people present, is holding or having the floor. And that was something that is a nugget of language that I learned from that show and has stuck with me all these years. It's actually quite a formal expression. The register of it is definitely not appropriate for everyday chit chat. Um, but that was actually one of the things that made this show interesting, because since it is based on a play from 16th century England, a lot of the language used in that show tended to be quite literary. And that makes it interesting. It is one of those ways in which you can, add sophistication to your language. You can add, some really nice, expressions to your linguistic repertoire. And that's one of them, from the show.
I know a lot of people who want to expand their vocabulary beyond the basic, just regular everyday language, right? One way you could do that is by reading novels, because when you read well novels or any kind of book, you expand your vocabulary. You meet all of these different words and expressions that people don't often say in just daily conversation. But also, I guess that's a great idea too. Watching a specific genre, if you're watching something that's sci-fi or something like Romeo and Juliet that takes place several hundred years ago, right, in that kind of ancient time, then that's going to be a way to expose yourself to vocabulary and to expressions that all native speakers know. However, we don't very often use, right? But from time to time, they do come up and we do use them. And so they are expressions, they are vocabulary that you do need to know if you want to hit that high level of fluency, because they will show their heads sometimes. So, yeah, that's a great idea to go to those specific genre pieces like Romeo and Juliet.
Absolutely. Yes. And some shows definitely lend themselves better, to that, um, let's say that type of activity, linguistic mining, you can, you can call it.
I'm curious, like at that point, to me, I think if you were, just a B1, B2 intermediate level English learner, and then you were to jump in to a more specific period animation like that, it might be a little bit too difficult. Like at this point, when you started watching Romeo and Juliet, where did you think your level was at? And did you find that it was overwhelming, or were you at the level, at the point in your English journey where you could understand most of it and it was just some specific words and phrases that were new to you? Like, what was it like starting off with a rather difficult series like that?
So interestingly, Romeo and Juliet is something that I actually ended up watching after I had been watching other shows for about a year before I stumbled upon that one. I feel that I was definitely ready. And I never really felt that it was overwhelming. In fact, I'll say this. Um, Remember that also in 2008, I started this pronunciation and accent training for myself. And something else that the shows were invaluable in was in confirming everything that I had been learning or that I learned about sounds, phonology, articulation, all of it. And so what ended up happening was that my ears got so attuned to the sounds of English that I was able to understand everything that I was hearing, and the language that would have been considered more refined or sophisticated, I was able to hear it phonetically, but I didn't know what the words meant. And so, what I also did was that as the years went by and I encountered all of this language, I was keeping record of it. I was writing it down on paper, good old, uh, you know, uh, pencil and paper.
The old fashioned way.
Exactly. But you know what? Looking back, I owe a great deal of what I'm able to recall to this day to that practice. Basically, the more senses you involve in learning, the better your recall is going to be. And I believe, anecdotally speaking, that that worked for me. And so I wasn't just sitting down and passively consuming, I was very active. With all the language, that I was practicing, all of this immersion that I was creating for myself. And so I think I went into these other shows, quite ready to, let's say, uh, you know, get into deeper waters.
And so, what would you do, like if you're watching the show and you come across some expression like to hold the floor, and you can hear it, okay, you know that they said to hold the floor or whatever the line was, and okay, you hear it, but you don't understand it. You don't know the meaning. You wrote it down in your notepad, but how would you realize, oh, this is an expression that I should learn and I should figure out what it means? Would you go to the dictionary in that situation? Maybe you had like Spanish translations of the subtitles available that you could consult with. Like, what would you do when you found a good expression to learn? How would you actually start to use it in your own English?
So sometimes I would write down example sentences. I didn't do that all the time. Um, Basically, for me, something was worth committing to memory if it was a recurring, lexical item. I think this is something that you actually touched on recently in one of the episodes for the podcast. That if a word is important, it will recur so often that eventually you will be forced to, uh, you know, have to find out what the meaning is, what the use of it is, and all of that stuff. And that happened, with most of these expressions for me. Uh, Something else that I did is that sometimes when I was able to, have it ready to mm, to use it, I would sometimes try out some of the expressions that I was learning at this conversation club that I used to go to way back in the day. Um, it That was all happening around the same time or within the same time period of those 2 or 3 years starting in 2008, all the way through 2012, give or take. But I had that, like, real life lab to test those expressions in. And to the best of my recollection, every time that I used one of those, it was used correctly. The
Wow.
intended effect was accomplished. I mean, people understood,
Mm.
and it was certainly, let's say, like a cut above the rest.
Yeah, well, it makes sense, right? You're learning from a real context, a real situation where that expression is going to be used. And then if that situation comes up in a conversation that you're having, and then you can use that expression, it's going to be a natural fit, which is why I think this method is so much better than just learning expressions from a book, right? Because you don't have that context that you need. So, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me that you would be able to be understood and to communicate what you want to communicate using the expressions you learned because you have that rich context to draw on. So that's great.
Absolutely. I learned the word. I don't remember what show I learned it from, but I learned the word repository from an anime show.
Hmm.
And I used it
Okay.
once during a conversation club meetup. And the person that I said this
Hmm.
to, who was an American, she was totally taken aback in the sense that she
She's
was,
like, what's a
you know,
repository?
well, well, she knew what the word meant, but the point is that she was absolutely not expecting that she would hear that from a non-native speaker.
We'll get to the other shows that you watched here in a moment, and I'm sure we could go on and on about the different details of them. But really, I wanted to focus for a little bit of time on more like your routine. So I think from my perspective, and I've been using some anime that's dubbed into the Korean language recently for studying Korean because that's the language that I study. So I have a little bit of a similar experience to you here, and it's cool to hear your stories because I'm looking forward to applying some of these to my life. Unfortunately, in my situation, a lot of the animes from Japan aren't actually dubbed into Korean. Korean people prefer to watch with subtitles. There are some dubs, but not as many. So I think guys uh, who are learning English, you guys who are learning English, you're lucky because you'll have all of these titles to draw on. I think a lot of them are dubbed into English, but for me, I kind of have to suffer through. And maybe I don't have access to them. But okay, so I wanted to get into your study routine. From my perspective, I think one of the great things about animes is usually the episodes are pretty short, right? They're like a 30-minute episode. So you don't have to commit a ton of time to watching something. It's not like an hour long Netflix drama. So you could watch as many or as little as you want to. Often, a lot of these series go on for years and years, so they'll have hundreds of episodes available, and you can really go on and on and on and follow these characters and follow the stories for again for years. So I'm wondering when you were watching them, how many hours were you spending a day? And were you just ripping through all of the episodes, like binge watching the series and trying to finish the series as quick as possible? Or were you going back and watching them again and again and again? And I know some real hardcore language learners also, they like to maybe put the audio from the show like onto their phone or onto their MP3 player and then listen to the audio. I've done that as well. I've taken some dubbed audio and then put it just onto my phone. So once I've seen the show, I don't need to watch the show again. I know the story, I know what happens. I can just listen to the audio. So I've even done that myself. I'm wondering, like, what was your routine like when you were studying with these animations?
It looked something like this. It was a mix of extensive listening and intensive listening. A lot of the time, I basically just binged shows. There are hundreds of series out there that are only 12 episodes long. Those are perfect for that type of extensive listening where you really just want to spend as much time as you can listening and getting used to the feeling of the language. The more intensive listening happened with the longer shows, the shows that go on for years, such as Naruto and Bleach. What's nice about longer shows is that the language recycles itself every so often, and you end up hearing the same type of words and expressions repeated often enough that eventually, they will stick with you. You will retain them in your memory. It's not spaced repetition, but I think it comes pretty close to it. On average, I must have been spending on average, to the best of my recollection, 2 hours a day watching, consuming, sometimes more attentively, sometimes less attentively. Sometimes, like I said, it was all about just that constant stream of language, just cycling through my brain to get used to, the feeling of it. I think that there's a lot to be said for input, um, or a lot of input before you start producing the language. I can say anecdotally that it's a sound approach. Um, and for the intensive moments, there were some shows that I did watch twice. There is one that it was quite memorable. And I think the reason why I watched it twice was because I actually compared the English and the Japanese dubs, and I liked the English dub way better. It's one of those
Okay.
rare instances where a foreign language dub surpassed the original one. I listened to the voice of the main character in both languages, and it just did not. Uh, it didn't feel punchy in Japanese. It was a whole nother thing in English.
Interesting. Well, tell us the name of the show, and then our Japanese listeners can maybe compare because it would be interesting to hear their opinion as well. Like, I wonder what they would have to say about that.
This one came out, I want to say, in 2007. It was called Welcome to the NHK.
It's the Broadcasting Corporation, I think, in Japan.
Yeah, yeah, it's kind of like it's like their version of PBS here in the US, or their version of the BBC in the UK.
Right, the Public Broadcasting Corporation. Okay,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yes.
And so, Jesus, I'm curious. Now that you've gone through this process of watching a lot of different series and you feel like you've broken through and hit that advanced level, if you were to go back now and let's imagine you have the knowledge that you have now of how you learned English and how you were successful with it, but you actually didn't do that. Okay, so let's imagine that you are back at that intermediate level. Knowing what you know now, if you were to go back and learn English again, would you do it exactly the same way? Is there anything that you would change about your approach? I know, I think it's just, yeah, really helpful for our listeners who are really in that same boat. I think a lot of our listeners are at the intermediate level and they want to break through and they're doing the right thing, right? They're spending time with English right now. But to hear it from somebody who's gone through the process could be super, super helpful. So, what would you recommend? What would your course of action be if you had to go back and learn English again?
Let's say that we're starting from the intermediate level. Um, I would I would probably um, follow the exact same trajectory with one important difference. I would definitely uh, make use of the spaced repetition system, perhaps Anki, for instance. These tools have gained immense popularity, in maybe last 10 years or so. It would certainly be a more effective way to review and recycle language that you really want to commit to memory. Um, that would be the one thing that I would change. Other than that, I think I would definitely, do it all over again.
Okay, awesome. And do you have any regrets about learning with anime at all? The only thing I'm curious about was if you noticed like any cultural things that were like made your English awkward or something because these are taking place in Japan, right? These series are made by Japanese people for a Japanese audience, but you're using it to learn a different language and apply that language in a different culture. So were there any like awkward things that you noticed, maybe in the translation or any cultural differences that set you back at all with your English learning? Because it's not just about learning the grammar and the vocabulary, it's about learning the culture and the different nuances to the culture as well. So, did you have any issues with that at all?
When a show is dubbed, it is also, to an extent, localized, meaning that there's a translation not just of language, but also of cultural norms and shorthands, that are not present, in the, let's say, the consumer audience that is going to be, watching let's call it the finished product. Perhaps just to give you one example, in general, I believe that there is this notion that there is a greater uh, sense of politeness and social hierarchy in Japanese culture. That doesn't really translate well into Western contexts. Thinking specifically of North America, the US, Canada, Mexico to an extent. And so maybe that would be the one thing where I would say that perhaps, um, if you were watching or consuming something that was produced in those cultures, you probably wouldn't see such a, let's say, extensive use of honorifics or different ways to sound more polite. I mean, that is certainly much more bound to a specific context, and they're more culturally bound aspects, non-linguistic, like paralinguistic kind of things, potentially, that there could have been a mismatch there, but nothing, nothing major really beyond that.
Hmm. Yeah, I wonder. Maybe you've had the same experience I did. I'm not sure, but living in Korea now, Korea is a bowing culture. So you bow when you greet someone. This is really common to do here, and so it's a part of my daily habits as a person living in Korea. But then when I go back home to visit Canada, I find myself sometimes bowing in Canada, where it's not the norm, and yeah, it's not like a huge cultural mistake or anything, but it's just one of those things that you get ingrained into your daily routine and your daily lifestyle. And then when you go to a different culture, it's hard to snap out of that habit immediately. So I don't know if you maybe gain some of those paralinguistic habits or customs from watching the animations, but probably not. Probably it's okay, right?
Yes. And perhaps one thing that, let's say, complemented or, let's say, kind of balanced the scales here was that I went through a phase with anime. Eventually, my interest in it began to peter out, and I ended up going for for other types of content. Um, in 2013 and 14, I was really into documentary series and TV series, live action stuff, especially these stories about survival. Like, I shouldn't be alive or I survived. I binged, those types of shows as well.
Like the Discovery Channel kinds of series.
Exactly. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay, cool. So maybe some balance is a good approach, right? Like go all in for a little while, but not forever, and kind of switch things up and follow your interests. Maybe that's the biggest takeaway that I could gain from what you've said here, and also to encourage our listeners as well, is like follow your interests. If you're interested in animation, watch animation. If you're interested in watching survival documentaries, then watch survival documentaries. But I guess you shouldn't force yourself to learn with something if it doesn't hold your interest, right? You're just gonna lose your motivation and probably end up quitting.
Exactly. Yes. And I really believe, that that level of interest, correlates. It's like directly proportional to, how much effort you're going to put into, you know, really making the most out of the time that you are investing. Think of time as something that you are investing, not wasting. And yeah, Absolutely, follow that, and you will make good use of your time.
Perfect. Okay, wise words. Jesus, we'll wrap things up here pretty soon because we're getting a little bit long with our episode, but I have to let you share the other titles because you said there were four specific titles. We talked about maybe two or three of them, but maybe there's one more that we didn't mention. I think maybe it was Bleach. Maybe you mentioned it in
Yes,
passing. Was that the fourth
yes,
one?
I have mentioned all 4 shows, here, like, uh, scattered, throughout the conversation, but just to bring them all
Right.
together. And
Yeah.
and in the order that I believe, I'm pretty sure that I watched them. Naruto was the first,
Okay.
Bleach was second, then came Welcome to the NHK, and finally, Romeo and Juliet.
Mm.
Um, and there were hundreds of others, in between those. But those are really the ones that are quite memorable in my mind, thanks to the language and thanks to the voice actors as well. Let me just leave you with one last thing because I think some of the audience here, I'm sure, were growing up back in the '90s when the Power Rangers were a thing. At least the
Yeah,
original,
that was me. Yeah.
Some of you might remember that in the Mighty Morphing seasons, the Black Ranger Zack was replaced by Adam. That was the character's name, but the actor's name is Johnny Young Bosch, and he voiced the main character in Bleach. The name of the character was Ichigo Kurosaki, and Johnny Young Bosch's performance was just absolutely phenomenal. The man had a way to really convey emotion in his lines, vary his intonation, his cadence, all of that. He really had what you can call a hero's voice. And I learned a lot, from him, not just about language, but also about, delivery, intonation, all of those things, that are part of, speaking a language and also having good speaking habits.
It's just striking me, Jesus, now that you mentioned that. I'm comparing maybe the situation of producing an animated series versus producing a sitcom, maybe. Like, let's compare it with Friends, maybe one of the biggest sitcoms of all time for English learners. English learners from around the world study English with Friends. Even though it's a series that's like 30 years old now, it's actually quite dated, but it still remains so popular. And yeah, I think it still can be quite funny as well. So, in a series like Friends, the actors are speaking on the spot. And of course, they're focused on delivering their lines well and speaking clearly. However, that's not their sole focus, right? They have to be funny with their expressions and their movements. And the microphones that they're using to record the sound aren't like really close to their mouths. They're these like special microphones that you use for recording audio in a TV set. So you don't get that super, super ultra clear, close audio quality. However, with an animation, the voice actor is really just focused on delivering the vocal aspect of the performance. So they're recording in a special like recording studio with a high quality mic. They're going to be very close to the microphone and they're going to put all of their effort into speaking clearly and enunciating and pronouncing everything just perfectly, right? So, from an English learner's perspective, you're going to get, of course, it's dramatic, it's emphasized and maybe over exaggerated. However, it's going to be super clear, and all of those nuances and emotional qualities of English are going to come through so much better than they would with just a regular sitcom, for example. So, yeah, that's another aspect that maybe we should take into consideration.
Yes, and you touched on that actually when we first talked, 2 years ago. But it bears repeating. A voice actor is, well, not all of them, but the voice actors that I used to admire, they were masters of their craft, and it really showed.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, right? They're not just any Joe Blows off the street. They're like
Exactly.
very trained professionals. So yeah, you get to hear from the best of the best when you're watching this kind of content.
And I stand by that opinion to this day.
Jesus, you got me fired up again. I love chatting with you because you always are so motivating. And like I said, you're just kind of the gold star standard for really the perfect English learner. You went through the process, you did all the work, you put in the time and the effort, and the results speak for themselves. So, yeah, thanks so much for coming back onto Culips and sharing your perspective. If our listeners have any questions for you, if they want to get in contact with you or maybe find you on the internet, do you have anything that you would like to share with us, like a website or social media or anything like that?
So I still have my YouTube channel and my Instagram page. Um, I've been inactive, for a while, but I actually just had like a like a stroke of inspiration over the weekend, and I put out my first reel and short of 2026. So, I mean, it's a 45-second clip, and most of the time, what I do is that I will be explaining something about English, but in Spanish, because I feel that that's the audience that I can speak to the most eloquently. But I think that you can still, benefit from it. I'm still kind of conflicted over whether I should make it always bilingual or pivot to English only. I haven't made up my mind there.
All right. Well, we'll put the links to your socials in the description for this episode. And also you're active from time to time on our Discord community as well. So listeners, if you have any specific questions or comments that you'd want to direct to Jesus, then maybe join us over on the Discord and I'm sure we'll have a little conversation about this episode over there. But yeah, I think we'll leave things here for now. Jesus, thank you so much for joining us again.
Absolutely, Andrew. The pleasure is all mine. And I'm very thankful, grateful for having given the opportunity again.
Yeah, it was awesome. We'll have you back on again in the future and we'll talk some more.
Absolutely. There's always more to talk about.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Jesus.
All right. Take care, Andrew. All right. Bye bye.
Thanks again to Jesus for coming on to Culips. I really enjoyed that conversation. I hope you did as well. If you'd like to connect with Jesus, I've put his links in the description for this episode so you can just follow them to check out his YouTube and his Instagram. Plus, come on over to our Discord community because he hangs out there from time to time too, and that would be a great place to get in touch with him. Speaking of our Discord community, it's free for anyone to join. You can do that just by following the link, which is also in the description for this episode. And we'll be having a conversation about this episode over on the Discord. So if you've got anything that you would like to add or any questions you would like to ask, that is a good place to do it. It's also a great place to be active with your English. Instead of just doing some passive listening, you can make sentences and post and interact with others. And we've got a great community over there on Discord, which of course is free to join as well, if I didn't mention that yet. So see you over on the Discord. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this episode. I know it was a long one, but yeah, great job. And take care. We'll see you in the next one. Until then, bye-bye.